Hi everyone, welcome back to Grounded Haven Homestead. Today I have another pantry challenge meals video for you, and I'm going to be sharing some of the meals we had in the last week. We've got lots of warm, hearty, comforting soups and meals, which were really perfect for the cold weather that we had that week, and I'll be showing you the recipes that I cooked. Before we go into the actual meals, I did a little bit of prep work at the beginning of the week, so I just want to show you what I did. First, I have about 4 cups of dried chickpeas, and I'm going to be cooking this in my Instant Pot. I'm just going to rinse them thoroughly and then cover them with plenty of water. These are unsoaked dried chickpeas, and they'll need plenty of water because they will expand a lot as they cook. I'm also going to add a teaspoon of salt to this and a couple of bay leaves. Dried chickpeas and also pretty much every other dried bean will take a really long time to cook if you just cook it on the stovetop, probably like an hour and a half to 2 hours. And using the Instant Pot will cut this time down and it'll just take a fraction of the time. Since these are unsoaked chickpeas, I'm cooking them for 15 minutes on high pressure in my Instant Pot. But if they were soaked, you could probably do like 12 minutes. So compared to an hour and a half, this drastically cuts down the time, and it's always really nice to just cook up a huge batch of these either in the beginning of the week or if I'm just doing like a big bulk cooking day, and I'll freeze these chickpeas away for later meals. While those chickpeas are cooking, I'm also going to be cooking some other dried beans afterwards, so I'm going to go ahead and just rinse and soak these. I have half kidney beans and half black beans here for a total of about 4 cups, and as I just showed you with the chickpeas, you don't actually have to soak your beans if you're going to be cooking them in the Instant Pot. You'll just have to add a few extra minutes, but since I'm going to be waiting for those chickpeas to cook anyway, I figured I would just give these black beans and kidney beans a little bit of a head start by soaking them for the half hour or so. After my chickpeas have cooked in the Instant Pot, this is what I ended up with. So with the 4 cups of chickpeas I started with, I ended up with almost like 12 cups of cooked chickpeas, and I've portioned them out into different containers. I'm going to make 2 different meals this week with chickpeas, so a couple of these containers are just going to go in the fridge, and then I also ended up with 2 pint-sized containers that I portioned out, and I can just put these away in the freezer for future meals since I won't need them this week. In my now empty Instant Pot, I just rinsed it out and I can put in the soaked kidney and black beans. And I'm going to add a couple of seasoning peppers to these. These are 2 arroz con pollo peppers that I have in the freezer. And then again, I'm going to add a few bay leaves and a teaspoon of salt. Again, I'm going to make sure that these are covered with water, and since these have been soaking for a little bit, I'm going to decrease the time to 10 minutes for these, and that should be fine for these since they're also a little bit of a softer bean than chickpeas. I always like to do at least like 2 batches of different kinds of beans in my Instant Pot, because if I've already gotten it out, then it's really easy to just do like back-to-back batches, and then I'll only have to wash my Instant Pot 1 time instead of 2 different times. So that's just the really easy prep work I did, and moving on to the meals. The first one is going to be a smashed chickpea salad wrap. I'm going to take about 3 cups of the cooked chickpeas that I just showed you that I cooked earlier, and I have drained these, and then I'm going to take a potato masher and start smashing these a little bit. They don't have to be like completely mashed, but I like to kind of break them up, maybe smash like 50 to 70% of them so that they have like a really nice texture and they start to kind of stick together a little bit. Next, I have 1 stalk of celery that I diced up, as well as 2 scallions, and I'm going to add that in. To season it, I'm going to add some salt and some pepper. And then we're also going to add some spices. I'm adding a little bit of paprika and also a sprinkle of turmeric. Then I'm going to add a tablespoon of Dijon mustard, and then also a couple tablespoons of mayo. Lastly, I'm going to add a few tablespoons of this zucchini relish that I canned up this past summer. This was a new recipe that I tried out this past year, and it's the first time that I'm using it, and I thought that this would be a perfect dish to try this in. Usually I'll add some kind of like diced up pickle into this chickpea salad, but I thought that the relish would be really nice to include, and I did really like this. It added really good flavor. It adds a little bit of tanginess since the relish is like a little bit vinegary, but it also has spices and onions in there, and it was really good in this. So I started with about 2 tablespoons, but then I added up another tablespoon later on. And this recipe is really flexible. You can do the relish, diced pickles like I talked about. You can also do capers. Just anything that has kind of like a tangy brininess is a really good addition to this salad. So I'm just gonna mix everything up, and this is what it's gonna look like. And I will pretty much just use this filling like you would use tuna fish or a chicken salad filling. It actually kind of has like a tuna salad flavor. I'm not really sure why, maybe it's the relish, but something about the combination of these ingredients is really nice. But this is a really good plant-based vegetarian version of it. For our meal, I made up these soft wraps, and I will link the recipe down below. It's a new one that I tried out and I really liked it. The texture of these wraps was really great, and it was perfect for this chickpea salad, but you can also just put it in any other kind of bread product that you want. You can use tortillas, sandwich wraps, or even just sandwich bread. And the way I like to assemble this is I put a little bit of Dijon mustard down on the wrap, then I will put a few heaping spoonfuls of the chickpea salad. I also added some pickles and some microgreens, and then a little drizzle of mayo on top. Because I cooked the chickpeas earlier in the week, this salad filling is really easy and quick to put together. And it's also a really great one for picnics or school or work lunches. I used to pack these sandwiches a lot to bring to the office, and it's a little bit less wet than like a tuna salad, so I find that it holds up a lot better. It doesn't make your bread very soggy, so you can assemble it that morning or even the night before. And I find that it doesn't like sog out too much, so it's a really great lunch to make ahead of time. For the next meal, I'm going to use up more of those cooked chickpeas, and I'm going to be trying another new recipe for me. This is a Chana masala, and I also made some naan to go along with it. The first thing I did was prepare the dough for the naan, since that needs time to rise. In my stand mixer bowl, I am putting about 1/4 cup of unsweetened Greek yogurt. You could also use sour cream here. And then I also added some warm water and 1 egg. And these are all my wet ingredients. I'm just going to give them a little bit of a mix beforehand. And then I'm going to add my dry ingredients, which are going to be salt, instant yeast, and flour. I will leave the ingredients for this naan down below in the description box. I'm going to mix this in the stand mixer for a few minutes until the dough is kind of smooth but still pretty tacky. This dough is a little bit on the wet and sticky side, so I'm using my bowl scraper to scrape down the edges and make sure everything is nicely combined. And then I'm going to spray my dough with a little bit of avocado oil and try and make sure that everything is lightly coated with oil so that it doesn't dry out. And then I'm going to cover this and let it rise for an hour. Meanwhile, I'm going to prep some ingredients for the chana masala. I have 1 yellow onion, which I am going to quarter. Then I have a few inches of ginger, which I have peeled, and I'm going to cut this into small chunks. None of this has to be very small or precise because I am going to be blending it all up in the food processor to create a paste. And then I also had 2 cloves of garlic, which I've peeled, and I'm just taking off the woody ends. And then I'm just going to put all these ingredients into my food processor. And then also one other ingredient I'm adding is some cilantro, stems and leaves all together. I'm adding a good handful of these, just whatever I was able to pick from the garden. The cilantro is actually still doing really well. Even in the dead of winter, I have been really impressed with it. So it was really nice to have some nice fresh herbs to include in this. So I'm gonna blitz this all together until it's all finely chopped and creates this really beautiful, herby, and flavorful paste. In a cold pan, I'm putting a few tablespoons of vegetable oil, and then I'm going to add in all of my aromatics that I just blended up while the pot is still cold so that all of the water content doesn't splatter in the oil. And then I'm going to cook this for a few minutes to really bring out and deepen those flavors. Meanwhile, in my food processor, I'm blending up 1 pint jar of home canned diced tomatoes, which we're going to use in this dish as well. By the way, this recipe is based off of a video that I just watched from America's Test Kitchen. I will link their video down below because that's where I got the recipe from. It's been a few minutes and the onion, ginger, garlic, cilantro mixture is starting to brown at the bottom of the pot and create a nice fond. Now I'm going to add in some of the spices. I added 1 teaspoon of cumin, 1 teaspoon of Kashmiri chili powder, and half a teaspoon of turmeric. I always love cooking Indian food at home because you get to cook with all of these amazing fragrant spices that impart so much flavor into your dish, and between the spices and the flavorful paste that we whipped up earlier, there's going to be so much flavor in this very simple dish. And they're all ingredients that you probably already have. Once you build up like a good supply of those spices that are commonly used, you can whip this dish up anytime. Then I'm going to add in a quart of my cooked chickpeas. This is about the equivalent of 2 cans of chickpeas if you just want to use store-bought canned chickpeas instead of homemade. And then one thing that's not in the original recipe that I decided to add is some frozen grated zucchini that I have drained. I thought that this would be a really nice addition since there aren't really like a lot of vegetables in this dish, and this would just make it a little bit more substantial and add some more nutrition to it. And then lastly, I'm going to add those pureed tomatoes and mix everything together, and I'm gonna let this simmer for about 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, I'm going to add the last of the spices, which is going to be 1.5 teaspoons of garam masala and a half teaspoon of salt. And then this is all going to simmer for another 10 minutes, just so that it can reduce a little bit and thicken up. So while that's happening, I can finish up and cook the naan. Here's what the dough looks like after it's risen for an hour. It has gotten really puffy. So I'm going to put this out onto my working surface and divide it into 8 pieces. For each of these pieces, I'm just going to use my fingers and gently pat it out into kind of this like long oval shape. I like it when naan kind of has this oval shape rather than like a perfect circle. It also makes it so that I can cook 2 of these in my pan side by side instead of 1 at a time. The dough was a little bit sticky and was kind of sticking to my cutting board, so after a while when I was working with it, I oiled my fingers and my cutting board, and that helped a lot to prevent the dough from sticking to me and to my surface. And then I'm going to be cooking this in my cast iron skillet. Before putting down my pieces of dough, I put about half a teaspoon of butter into my pan and spread it around so that each piece of naan will have some buttery flavor to it. And then I can lay 2 pieces down in my 12-inch skillet side by side. Let that cook for a few minutes until I can start to see that it's bubbling on one side and the underside is nicely browned, and then I can flip them over and cook them for another couple of minutes. Then I'll remove them to a plate where I'll keep them warm with a towel, and in between each batch I'll make sure to add some fresh butter and spread that around. Sometimes I also like to spread a garlic butter on the naan, and that's also really good. It's just one extra step that I didn't do today, but if you want to go that extra step, you can add a few cloves of minced garlic and add it to a few tablespoons of melted butter. And then usually if I do that, instead of melting the butter in my pan, I'll just spread the melted butter directly onto each side of the naan as I cook it, just to make sure that the butter is like evenly coating the naan. So that's a really delicious option if you want to take it one step further. But even without the garlic, just this regular butter naan is still so delicious. It's really fluffy and chewy, and when it's freshly cooked like this, it's going to be so nice to pair with our chana masala. Now the entire meal is done, I'm going to top off the chana masala with some more fresh cilantro that I've chopped. And if I had some lime wedges, I would also serve that with this. And I'm really happy with how this chana masala came out. Like I said, this was a new recipe for me, but definitely one that I would make again. It's a really great pantry meal that uses spices and aromatics to pair with some humble chickpeas, and the shredded zucchini worked really well in it also. The next meal I'm going to show you is a beef, bean, and pumpkin chili that I made along with some cornbread. The first thing I had to do was roast up a pumpkin, so I took one of our homegrown pumpkins. The best way I find to break open a pumpkin is just to ask Aaron to smash it outdoors. These pumpkins in particular have a really thick rind, so it's very hard for me to get in there with a knife. If I just have him smash it, he can break it into a few pieces for me, and then I'll just clean out all the seeds and the pulp inside. I'll place it on a baking sheet and roast this in the oven at 400 degrees for about 50 to 60 minutes until the flesh is really nice and soft. After it's cooked, I will scoop out the meat of the pumpkin, and you can either puree it, or if you don't want to take out your food processor, you can also just chop it into little pieces, which will work just fine for this meal. Then in a large pot, I'm melting down some of our beef tallow. I am going to be using meat in this chili, but the tallow does help to give a little bit more beef flavor. Then I'm going to add in 1 pound of ground beef, and I'm just going to break it up a little bit and then try not to stir it for a few minutes so that that first side can brown. Then after the first side has browned, I can start breaking up the meat and flipping it over. I'll make sure to salt generously with salt and pepper. And once the meat is cooked about 80% of the way, I can start adding some other ingredients. First, I have 1 very large onion that I diced up, along with a few cloves of garlic that I've minced. I also have some frozen bell peppers, so I'll add some of those. And I'll just mix this all together and let those vegetables cook for a little bit and soften up. After those vegetables have cooked for a few minutes, it's time to start adding some ingredients that are really going to add a lot of flavor to our chili. First, I'm adding about 1.5 tablespoons of chili powder, which is a mix of spices that has things like paprika, cumin, garlic powder, and oregano. Then I'm going to add in 1/2 can of tomato paste, and then also a couple of tablespoons of chipotle peppers in adobo. You buy these in cans and they come as whole peppers in this red sauce. What I like to do is I'll buy a couple of cans, I'll puree the cans in my food processor and portion it out into these little tablespoon quantities and stick them in my freezer. So I had just pulled out 2 of those cubes to use in this dish. These add a little bit of spice because they are jalapenos, but they also add a lot of smoky flavor as well, which is really nice in the chili. I'm going to saute this for a good few minutes to really fry off those spices and the tomato paste. This is going to deepen the flavors and help the spices to bloom. Next, I'm adding 1 quart of our home canned diced tomatoes along with plenty of the beans that I cooked in the beginning of the video. This is the mix of black beans and kidney beans, and this is a total of about 6 cups, which is lots of beans. I like our chili to be very heavy on the beans and less so on the meat. I think of the meat as just there for flavoring, and I like to really bulk it up with beans because, well, beans are cheap, so it really helps our chili to stretch out and we can have it for more meals. Then I'm going to add about 2 cups of the pumpkin that I've chopped up. And whenever I add pumpkin to my chili, I also like to add a sprinkle of cinnamon. It really helps to bring out like lots of warm flavors. And I also just think that would be a great ingredient even if you're not including the pumpkin. It just adds some extra depth to the chili. Lastly, I'm going to add 2 cups of chicken broth just to give this some more liquid, but a lot of the ingredients like the tomatoes and the beans had a lot of liquid already, and we want our chili to be nice and thick and not too soupy. So just a little bit of chicken broth will be perfect. I'm going to let this simmer on the stove for at least half an hour to really let all of those flavors meld and for the chili to start thickening up. Meanwhile, I'm going to put together some cornbread. So in a bowl, I'm adding all of my dry ingredients. The last time I made cornbread, I made up a few of these containers where I put all of the dry ingredients and they're already all measured out. So all I have to do is dump it into my bowl. So this mixture has the flour, cornmeal, baking powder, salt, and sugar. And then all I have to do is add the wet ingredients to this, which is going to be some melted butter, an egg, and milk. It's really handy to just have all of those dry ingredients pre-mixed, and it makes the process a lot faster. Once I add all of the wet ingredients, I'm just going to stir this just to combine, and then I'm going to place this into an 8x8 glass Pyrex dish, which I have prepped with some avocado oil spray. Then I'm going to bake this at 400 degrees for 25 to 30 minutes until the cornbread is completely set all the way through. By the time the cornbread is done, the chili will be ready as well. It's had lots of time to just simmer away, and the last thing I like to do is add some frozen corn and just stir it in right at the end so that it retains a lot of its fresh flavor. And all you have to do is just mix it in with the hot chili, and that will be enough to defrost it. I ended up with a huge batch of this chili. I think it ended up being like 10 servings, which will last us an entire week. But chili is one of those things that we don't mind eating every day because we like it so much, but it also makes for a really nice meal to freeze for later on if you don't want to eat the same thing every day. It's also a really budget-friendly meal because of all the beans I put in there, and I only had to use 1 pound of meat, and I put in lots of homegrown veggies. So here's the finished chili, and we like to top it off with lots of different fun toppings. First off, I have some grated cheddar cheese, then I'm going to add a dollop of sour cream, and then I also had just a little bit left of my pickled radishes and red onions, so I added some of that as well. The texture of it is so nice, it thickened up really well, and I think the pumpkin really helps with that. It adds a really nice thickness to the chili. And also here is how the cornbread came out. Really nice and fluffy, and it's probably like one of the easiest quick breads you can make. And it was even faster than usual with those pre-measured dry ingredients, so I'm definitely going to be doing that again next time. The last meal in this video is going to be a chicken soup with some cheddar and scallion scones. First off, in my Dutch oven, I'm adding a few tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil, and then I had prepped up lots of different vegetables. I have 1 large onion, 4 stalks of celery, 4 carrots, and 5 cloves of garlic, and I've diced all of those up. I'm going to add them all at once to the pot, add salt and pepper to season, and just let them sweat out in the pot for a few minutes. Once those have softened for a bit, I am going to add lots of homemade chicken bone broth. I think I ended up adding 3 quarts of broth in total. I basically just wanted to fill up the pot at least halfway and make sure it was like really nice and loose and soupy, because later on I am going to be cooking pasta in this, so I want to make sure that there's lots of extra broth for the pasta to soak up, and once that expands, it's going to take up some volume as well. There actually isn't going to be any pieces of chicken or meat in this soup. All of the chicken flavor is just going to be from this bone broth, but it is homemade chicken bone broth that has a lot of really rich flavor in it. So it's still going to taste like chicken soup even though there is no meat. And I made this bone broth with chicken bones that I had in the freezer, so it was really nice to get those out and put them to use. And while that's heating up, I'm going to make the cheddar and scallion scones. I'm starting off with 2 cups of flour, and I'm adding baking powder and salt. I'm going to mix those ingredients together and then start working in 6 tablespoons of butter that I've cubed up, and just work it with my fingers until it's nice and crumbly and I have like pea-sized pieces of butter in my flour. This is probably one of the best like bread or pastry products that I have made recently that I really wanted to share. And even though the scallions that I'm putting in there are not a pantry ingredient, they were fresh store-bought scallions. These scones just came out so good that I wanted to share them anyway, so hopefully you'll forgive me for that. I think if you try out this recipe, you will not be mad. After I've worked in the butter, I can add in 3 scallions that I've sliced up, as well as 2 cups of cheese. I'm using half of an extra sharp white cheddar and then half of a regular yellow cheddar. I actually forgot that the recipe said 2 cups of cheese, and I did only 1 cup of cheese, and they definitely were not as good as the last time I made them when I used the full 2 cups, so do not skimp on the cheese because they will add a lot of flavor to the scones. Then I'm going to mix my wet ingredients together that I'm going to add to this mixture. First, I have 2 eggs. And I'm also adding a tablespoon of Dijon mustard to this, as well as a 1/3 cup of heavy cream. I'm adding the wet ingredients to my dry ingredients, and then I'm just going to gently fold this all together and try not to overwork it, but just mix it enough so that there are no really big dry patches of flour. Then on my work surface, I'm going to dust this with lots of flour because this dough will be sticky. And then I'm going to dump out my scone mixture onto this flour and gently work it and pat it into a long rectangle. It should be about 10 inches long and 2 inches wide, and then we're going to cut this into 5 pieces along the length of the dough that should be roughly square shaped. And I'm just gently patting this out with my hands until it's about an inch thick. Once I have my 5 squares, I'm going to cut each of these squares into triangles, and then I'm going to place these onto a baking sheet, and they're going to cook at 375 degrees for 20 to 22 minutes. While the scones are in the oven, I can finish off my soup. One thing I forgot to add earlier was some dried rosemary, so I'm adding that now. And then I'm going to add some Orzo pasta, maybe about 1/3 to 1/2 cup. These are going to expand as they cook, so I just want to make sure that I don't add so much that it absorbs all of the liquid in our soup. And Orzo is kind of like a grain-shaped pasta, so this is kind of like a mix between a chicken noodle soup and a chicken and rice soup. It kind of gives that same sort of vibe. The Orzo is going to need about 10 minutes to cook, and then at the very end I'm going to add some of my frozen kale, which is going to add some really lovely fresh green color to this. And then the meal is finished. So we have our finished soup. The Orzo has really plumped up nicely and absorbed all of that delicious chicken broth. And then we have our cheddar and scallion scones as well. You can also give this soup a squeeze of lemon, and this makes it taste really nice and fresh. It doesn't get any more comforting than a bowl of chicken soup, and it was definitely called for this week when we had a bit of a cold snap. Not as cold as a lot of other people got, but this was definitely a very nourishing, warming meal for the week. Here are the finished scones. They are so nice and fluffy, and the cheese and the scallions are such a good mix. I'm generally not like a sweet scone person, but give me a savory scone any day of the week. That's going to be it for today's pantry challenge video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next one.